You admit he cut the umbilical cord. You even admit,
if this is my grandbaby, I just don't want her to go through what I went through.
That another man was at the hospital when your daughter was born. Pro football player who you say is being taken advantage of by the defendant. You argue she's told your son and another man that they are her 3-year-old daughter's biological father. You suddenly changed your mind and believe Mr. Boyd is her biological father.
Your Honor, I raised my child to be a good man and a father. The child that I believe is his, but also for the other 2 children that she have. I believe the man was my dad for 7 years. And when he passed away, I found out he wasn't my father.
That it's a possibility, either or could be the father of this child. And in my heart, I felt like it was the other guy because he was there and he stayed around.
This court proceeding unfolds before Judge Lauren Lake, where multiple emotionally charged cases are brought forward by families desperate for clarity, accountability, and truth. The courtroom becomes the evidence stage in a divorce case of emotions, trust, and responsibility, where biology, loyalty, and justice collide. Each person who steps forward believes they are ready for the truth, yet many soon realize that a DNA test is something people regret taking once reality replaces hope. In the first matter, a young man arrives with his mother, both seeking resolution over the paternity of a 3-year-old child. The mother explains that her son, a semi-professional athlete, has been emotionally and financially pulled into a situation clouded by uncertainty. 2 men have been told they may be the child's father, and for years the confusion has shaped the child's identity. Judge Lauren Lake listens closely as the parties explain how overlapping relationships, inconsistent timelines, and emotional bonds have created a complicated relationship between law and justice. The mother of the child admits another man was present at the hospital during the birth, signed the birth certificate, and has been involved in the child's early life. Yet doubts emerged later when physical resemblance and renewed communication reopened old questions. Evidence is introduced, photos, timelines, and official documents, showing how assumptions replaced facts. This becomes a powerful example of how adverse inference in Evidence Act discussions arise when actions do not align with claims. As testimony continues, Judge Lake emphasizes that resemblance is not proof. She explains the concept of justice in jurisprudence, reminding everyone that emotional belief must never outweigh scientific truth. The DNA test result confirms that the man who built a relationship with the child is not the biological father. The courtroom reacts with heavy emotion as the reality settles in. The outcome highlights how truth changes everything, a theme often discussed in platforms like the Truth Changes Everything podcast and the Game Changing Attorney podcast. Despite the result, Judge Lake carefully addresses the emotional damage that uncertainty has already caused. She reminds the parties that while biology matters, the emotional welfare of the child must remain central. This case becomes a lesson in how adoption stories' full episodes often begin, not from abandonment, but from unresolved truth. The second case introduces an adult woman seeking answers after decades of confusion. She explains that throughout her childhood, different men were named as her father. Eventually, she learns that the man who raised her is not biologically related to her. This revelation deeply affected her sense of identity and belonging. Now, standing in court for the first time with a man she believes may be her biological father, she hopes for closure. Judge Lauren Lake carefully walks through the emotional history, pointing out how long-term uncertainty often leads individuals to search for meaning in resemblance, behavior, and coincidence. The alleged father arrives with his wife, explaining that he never knew the child existed. Photos are submitted, showing striking similarities between the woman and the man's family members. The courtroom witnesses the fragile hope that often surrounds reunion cases, similar to those shared in Celebrate Recovery testimonies. However, the DNA results again deny expectations. The man is not the biological father. The disappointment is profound, yet Judge Lake reframes the moment as part of a longer journey toward truth. She explains that justice does not always deliver the answer people want, but it always delivers the answer people need. This reinforces discussions often heard in the relationship between law and justice discourse. The third case escalates the tension further. A man and his mother accuse a woman of deception, infidelity, and manipulation. They believe the woman intentionally misled multiple partners during overlapping relationships. Evidence includes text messages, hospital records, and contradictory statements. Judge Lake dissects each inconsistency, demonstrating how dishonesty erodes credibility in court and invites adverse inference. The woman admits to lying, but explains her actions stemmed from a desire to build a family she never had. Judge Lake acknowledges the emotional pain behind the behavior, but makes it clear that intentions do not excuse deception. This moment mirrors discussions from DNA test cheating stories and the Divorce Course podcast, where emotional desperation often leads to irreversible consequences. When the DNA test result confirms paternity in this case, the courtroom shifts from conflict to accountability. The man is confirmed as the father, and Judge Lake stresses the legal implications, including future responsibilities related to Supreme Court child support principles. She explains that while the truth may bring relief, it also brings lifelong responsibility. Across all cases, Judge Lauren Lake emphasizes that DNA testing is not a weapon, but a tool. It should not be used to manipulate relationships or delay accountability. Each story illustrates how evidence, when ignored or misused, can damage lives. The courtroom becomes a real-life reflection of topics discussed in podcast evidence stage in divorce case analyses, where facts eventually overpower narratives. By the end of these proceedings, one truth becomes unavoidable. The court does not exist to validate feelings, but to uncover facts. Whether the result brings closure or heartbreak, the truth reshapes families, identities, and futures. These cases demonstrate why people seek justice through law, and why the truth, once revealed, cannot be undone. This courtroom journey stands as a powerful reminder that, when individuals walk into court seeking answers, they must be prepared for outcomes that redefine everything they believe. As the courtroom proceedings continue, Judge Lauren Lake reinforces a central principle that echoes throughout every case brought before her. Truth is not optional in matters of family, identity, and responsibility. Each person standing in court carries emotional expectations shaped by years of assumptions, promises, and silence. Yet the law demands something far more precise: verifiable facts supported by evidence. This tension between hope and proof defines the atmosphere of the courtroom. In each case, the court carefully examines not just who may be biologically related to a child, but how uncertainty itself becomes a form of harm. Judge Lake explains that prolonged doubt creates emotional instability, especially for children who are asked, directly or indirectly, to accept shifting definitions of family. This perspective highlights the deeper relationship between law and justice, where legal clarity is often the first step toward emotional healing. The cases reveal a recurring pattern. Many individuals enter court believing they already know the outcome. Physical resemblance, emotional bonding, and shared experiences are treated as confirmation. Judge Lake consistently reminds the courtroom that resemblance is circumstantial, not conclusive. This is why the DNA test exists, not to punish, but to settle questions that emotions alone cannot answer. The court becomes a real-life example of why people regret taking DNA tests, only when they expect science to confirm belief rather than reveal truth. One of the strongest themes that emerges is how misinformation spreads when honesty is delayed. Several parties admit they avoided testing for years, hoping circumstances would resolve themselves. Instead, confusion grew deeper. Judge Lake explains that delayed truth often leads to compounded damage, forcing courts to untangle emotional attachments formed under false assumptions. This discussion aligns with broader legal conversations often raised in the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where delayed accountability is shown to be more destructive than immediate honesty. The courtroom also addresses the role of evidence in shaping outcomes. Documents, text messages, timelines, and birth records are presented methodically. Judge Lake demonstrates how contradictions invite adverse inference in Evidence Act principles. When statements shift or facts are concealed, the court is permitted to question credibility. This is not punishment, it is logic. The law functions on consistency, not sympathy. In one particularly intense moment, Judge Lake confronts the idea that wanting something to be true does not make it so. She explains that desire can blur judgment, especially when individuals feel pressure to create a family structure they believe they lack. This emotional motivation is acknowledged, but never allowed to override factual determination. The concept of justice in jurisprudence is clearly illustrated here. Justice is not defined by emotional comfort, but by truthful resolution. The courtroom also explores how adults sometimes prioritize their emotional needs over the stability of children. Judge Lake speaks directly about the responsibility adults carry when introducing potential parental figures into a child's life without certainty. She explains that while love and care matter deeply, clarity matters just as much. This reflection mirrors lessons commonly shared in adoption stories' full episodes, where transparency becomes essential to long-term well-being. As testimony unfolds, Judge Lake remains firm yet empathetic. She listens without interruption, allows emotions to surface, but consistently guides the discussion back to facts. This judicial approach transforms the courtroom into an educational space, one that reflects the values often highlighted in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where clarity, preparation, and honesty define effective legal outcomes. The court also touches on the legal consequences that follow DNA confirmation. Once paternity is established, the discussion naturally extends to responsibility, stability, and long-term planning. Judge Lake references how child support obligations are not about punishment, but about ensuring a child's needs are met fairly. This aligns with foundational principles often referenced in Supreme Court child support rulings, where the child's welfare remains paramount. Throughout these cases, Judge Lake emphasizes that the courtroom is not a place for revenge or validation. It is a place for resolution. Individuals who entered hopping to prove someone wrong often leave realizing the greater importance of protecting a child's future. This shift in perspective underscores why legal processes exist, to replace chaos with structure and uncertainty with clarity. Another recurring issue is the emotional aftermath of DNA results. Judge Lake addresses how people must cope with outcomes that contradict years of belief. She encourages emotional maturity, reminding parties that relationships formed under false assumptions require careful handling going forward. This moment reflects discussions seen in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where acceptance becomes the foundation for growth. The court proceedings also expose how secrecy often stems from fear of abandonment, fear of responsibility, or fear of losing emotional security. Judge Lake acknowledges these fears, but firmly states that fear-driven deception inevitably leads to greater loss. The courtroom becomes a mirror for real-life consequences, reinforcing lessons often discussed in the Divorce Course podcast, where transparency is essential to healthy family dynamics. By this stage in the proceedings, the audience understands that these cases are not isolated incidents. They represent a broader societal struggle with truth, accountability, and emotional honesty. Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom serves as a controlled environment where those struggles are confronted directly, without shortcuts or emotional manipulation. As each case progresses toward resolution, one message becomes unmistakable. The truth will surface, with or without cooperation. The only question is how much damage is done before it does. The court offers closure, but it cannot erase years of confusion. That responsibility lies with the individuals who chose delay over honesty. This portion of the courtroom journey reinforces a powerful reality. Law does not exist to replace morality, but to enforce accountability when morality fails. Each ruling, each explanation, and each DNA result adds another layer to a central lesson. When truth is postponed, justice becomes more painful, not less. The proceedings continue with that understanding firmly established, setting the stage for final resolutions that will permanently redefine families, responsibilities, and identities. As the court proceedings reach their final stage, Judge Lauren Lake brings the focus back to the lasting impact of the truth once it is revealed. By this point, every person in the courtroom understands that DNA results are not simply answers to a legal question. They are turning points that permanently reshape lives. The courtroom atmosphere reflects a mixture of relief, grief, acceptance, and responsibility, all coexisting in the same space. Judge Lake explains that many people enter court believing the DNA test will solve everything instantly. In reality, the test only answers one question: biology. What follows is often more complex. Emotional bonds do not disappear with a result, nor do years of confusion automatically heal. This is why the court emphasizes preparation before testing, a lesson frequently discussed in platforms like People Regret Taking DNA Test conversations, where individuals underestimate the emotional weight of scientific truth. Throughout the cases, it becomes clear that deception rarely begins with malicious intent. Many parties admit they were overwhelmed, uncertain, or emotionally desperate. However, Judge Lake makes a critical distinction. Understanding why someone lied does not excuse the damage caused by the lie. This principle reflects the deeper concept of justice in jurisprudence, where accountability exists even when intentions are flawed. The court carefully addresses how children are affected most by prolonged uncertainty. Judge Lake highlights that when adults delay truth, children are forced to live within unstable narratives. Calling two men father, adapting to shifting family roles, and sensing emotional tension all leave lasting impressions. The law steps in not to assign blame, but to stop the cycle of confusion. This approach mirrors lessons often emphasized in adoption stories' full episodes, where honesty becomes essential for identity and emotional security. Judge Lake also speaks about the misuse of resemblance as proof. Across all cases, physical similarities were repeatedly presented as evidence. The court clarifies that while resemblance can create emotional belief, it has no legal standing. This reinforces the importance of evidence at every stage of a case, particularly the evidence stage in divorce case proceedings, where assumptions often collapse under scrutiny. In the final rulings, Judge Lake underscores how the court weighs credibility. Inconsistent timelines, hidden relationships, and contradictory statements allow the court to apply adverse inference in Evidence Act principles. When someone withholds information, the law is permitted to draw conclusions about intent and reliability. This is not about punishment. It is about protecting the integrity of the process. One of the most important moments comes when Judge Lake addresses responsibility after confirmation of paternity. She explains that confirmation is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of obligation. Emotional relief must be followed by action. Financial support, emotional presence, and consistency are legal and moral duties. These principles align closely with Supreme Court child support standards, where the focus remains firmly on the child's long-term welfare. Judge Lake also addresses those who receive negative DNA results. She explains that while the law recognizes biological boundaries, it does not invalidate emotional connections. However, continuing a relationship requires careful consideration of the child's emotional health. Sudden disappearance can be just as harmful as prolonged confusion. This guidance reflects real-life challenges often discussed in the relationship between law and justice conversations, where emotional ethics extend beyond legal rulings. As the courtroom listens, Judge Lake reminds everyone that truth is not cruel, uncertainty is. Many of the participants admit that knowing the answer, even when painful, brings clarity they never had before. This is why the phrase "truth changes everything" is not a warning, but a reality. Once revealed, truth forces growth, accountability, and decision-making that can no longer be avoided. The court also reflects on how external influences, family pressure, financial expectations, and social judgment often complicate these cases. Parents, grandparents, and partners sometimes push for outcomes that align with hope rather than fact. Judge Lake firmly reiterates that the court cannot serve expectations, it serves evidence. This philosophy echoes themes commonly explored in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where preparation and honesty determine outcomes. Another critical lesson emphasized in the final moments is that the court is not a tool for emotional leverage. Judge Lake cautions against using paternity claims to secure commitment, financial support, or emotional attachment. When the law is used strategically rather than truthfully, it ultimately exposes the very deception it was meant to protect. This reflection closely aligns with discussions from DNA test cheating stories, where manipulation often backfires. Judge Lake also acknowledges the courage it takes to face these results publicly. Coming to court means surrendering control over the narrative. Once the test is ordered, the outcome belongs to science, not emotion. She recognizes the bravery of those who chose resolution over denial, even when the result was not what they wanted. As the final judgments are delivered, Judge Lake encourages all parties to focus forward. She explains that the purpose of the court is not to dwell on past mistakes, but to prevent future harm. Accountability, honesty, and consistency become the tools for rebuilding trust. This philosophy resonates strongly with messages found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where healing begins with acceptance. The courtroom also serves as a reminder that legal closure does not always equal emotional closure. Some questions remain unanswered, and some relationships must be redefined rather than repaired. Judge Lake advises seeking counseling, mediation, or structured communication when necessary. The law provides the framework, but emotional healing requires personal effort. In her closing remarks, Judge Lauren Lake reiterates that the court exists to protect the most vulnerable, children who cannot advocate for themselves. Every ruling, every explanation, and every DNA result ultimately serves that purpose. Adults may leave with disappointment or relief, but children leave with clarity, and clarity is the foundation of stability. By the end of these proceedings, one truth stands above all others. The courtroom is not a place where stories compete. It is where facts prevail. Whether the result confirms or denies expectations, the law ensures that uncertainty ends and responsibility begins. This final stage of the court's journey reinforces a lasting message. When people seek answers through the legal system, they must be prepared for outcomes that redefine relationships, identities, and futures. The truth may be difficult, but it is the only path toward real justice.